Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I will be introducing our speaker tonight. And before I do that, I just have a few words about the Grand Canyon Historical Society. Tonight's outing is by Alan Petersen, who's friends with many of you, Gunnar Widforss, Master of the Inner Canyon. And as most of you probably know, Alan has been researching the work of Gunnar Widforss for many, many years, and we're so happy to hear from him tonight about some of his lesser known paintings from the Inner Canyon. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, we are a nonprofit organization established to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's culture and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And as of last year, we are now 40 years old as an organization. If you are not a member of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, our dues are only $35 a year. And we hold these monthly virtual outings, but we also publish a very popular quarterly magazine called The Old Pioneer. And there on the left, you can see the cover of the winter 2025 issue, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. We do these virtual outings. We occasionally have in-person tours of Grand Canyon history subjects, and you will be able to watch a recording of this and all of our past virtual outings on our website and our Facebook page. For those of you that will be around next month on April the 8th, we will have the third installment from Mike Nelson, who has written the definitive book about the tragic air collision that happened over Grand Canyon on June 30th, 1956. Mike has already given us two virtual outings, and we'll finish up with the conclusion remarks about this fascinating story. So our virtual outing tonight, as I said, is Gunnar Widforss, Master of the Inner Canyon. Alan worked at the south rim of the Grand Canyon for 3 years before moving to Flagstaff in 1980, where he attended NAU, and he earned degrees in painting and art history. And he recently is retired as a professor from Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, where he taught classes pertaining to the Colorado Plateau. In 2020, he published the Catalogue raisonné of the works of the Swedish-American Gunnar Widforss, and that is what we were going to hear about tonight. And so if I can stop sharing my screen, I will allow Alan to begin. And Alan, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the group. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Wayne. It's really great to see you all. Thanks for coming. I think you'll find this interesting, so I'm going to share my screen and get some pictures up here. What I'm going to show you tonight is an extended version of the talk that I gave at the last Grand Canyon History Symposium 2 years ago. And I want to say, so I saw on my little introduction thing there, the big news is, although nothing has been signed yet, I believe I have a publisher for my book on Gunnar. So that's, yeah, pretty exciting news. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here. So over the last 130 years, Grand Canyon has been the subject of a great many works of art, but most of them have been done from the canyon rim. A small and adventurous number of artists have worked below the rim over the years, but until recently, this has been uncommon. And before 1973, and I'll refer that date, I'll come back to that date in a minute, no painter had produced as many inner canyon paintings as Swedish-American painter Gunnar Widforss, who, just for reference, was born in Stockholm in 1879 and died at the South Rim just outside the Altivar Hotel in 1934. In the 1920s and 30s, Widforss actively pursued inner canyon subjects, often making vigorous hikes to do so, and the quality of his work has set the standard for contemporary artists who view him as their mentor. The earliest paintings, works of art in general, done of the canyon were done for a couple of geological surveys, most notably the John Wesley Powell survey, including this woodcut by Thomas Moran. And it's interesting to note, so if you know anything about the history of the Powell survey and maybe Moran's relationship with John Wesley Powell, Moran actually never visited the river, at least not in his first visit with Powell in 1873. But Powell's final report, written by Clarence Dutton and published in 1882, was richly illustrated with a number of works by Thomas Moran, both woodcuts like this and a couple of paintings, as well as drawings. Sorry, that looks a little blurry. Including drawings made by William Henry Holmes, including this set made from the flanks of Mount Trumbull out in the western Grand Canyon. In the early 20th century, the Santa Fe Railroad spurred interest in Grand Canyon as a subject with its masterful marketing plan that relied on well-known artists visiting areas that the Santa Fe serviced and producing paintings of those locations for the railroad that were then used for a variety of marketing purposes, everything from calendars to train timetables and just reproductions of paintings that they would sell. Santa Fe Railroad advertising director Charles Higgins initiated this practice in 1892 when he invited Thomas Moran back to the Grand Canyon, which Moran had not revisited since 1873. And in 1892, Moran did go below the rim. And okay, sorry, I don't actually have that Moran painting, sorry. But we can look at this. But in 1892, Moran and Higgins visited John Hance out his place, and they made an adventurous trip down Hance's trail to the river. So another early painter of the Grand Canyon is Louis Aiken. So I'm going to just give you a little historical background here initially. Louis Aiken was one of the earliest artists, aside from Moran, to work at the canyon, and he did do a number of paintings below the rim, but really probably only maybe half a dozen or so. Another early painter who worked extensively below the rim was William Robinson Lay, who in 1907 spent a month camped below Columbus Point off of what's now the Boucher Trail. And he wrote a wonderful article about his experience for Out West magazine. Has anybody read that? I can't see, but if you want a good adventure story about an artist in the Grand Canyon, his 1909 article in Out West is really a fabulous read. And just one of my favorite episodes in that is where he talks about huddling under his umbrella during the day to get out of the sun, and it being so hot that his oil paint was starting to melt and slide off of his palette. So he talks about balancing his palette to keep his paint from all running off. So let's see. Other notable artists who worked below the rim, at the canyon and below the rim, at least on occasion, and who also produced works for the Santa Fe Railroad, included Carl Oscar Borg, who we'll come back to in a minute, Howard Cook, Edward Pothast, and Lewis Henry Sharp, all of whom are, big names in early Western painting. But aside from these artists and Gunnar, really the world below the rim didn't receive a lot of attention between, let's just say, 1873 when Moran paid his first visit, and then in 1973 when Bruce Aiken moved to Roaring Springs to work at the water plant there. And Aiken would become, here's one of Bruce's paintings called Below the Tonto Platform. Bruce would go on to do hundreds of paintings of the Inner Canyon in the 30 years that he spent living at Roaring Springs. And then shortly after that, in the 1980s, you recall, was a period when the number of people going through the canyon by river literally exploded, with a great rise in the number of commercial outfits and permits and an increasing number of permits for private boaters. And the first artist to do a river trip through the Grand Canyon was Merrill Mahaffey in 1881. And Merrill really, his paintings, I think, really caught the public's eye and caught the eye of artists. And by the mid 80s, more and more artists were visiting both the river and the Inner Canyon. It's interesting to note, too, that the following year in 1882, Merrill chartered a hatch trip and took 28 other artists on a trip that they called the Recession Artists Float Trip, or RAFT, which resulted in an exhibition that you might have seen in one of several locations in Arizona. The work they produced became a traveling exhibition. And then Kurt Walters, another great contemporary painter of the canyon, first visited in 1972, and by the 80s he was doing numerous paintings below the rim, and I think probably like Bruce and Merrill, his paintings done below the rim probably easily number in the hundreds at this point. But aside from Gunnar Widforss, for most of the artists working in the Inner Canyon between 1892 and 1982, their experience was a single visit, or maybe a couple of visits. No real commitment to the kind of effort that it took to work below the rim. Here's, as you can see, here's Kurt at Cedar Ridge, and everything he's got he had to carry in and carry out. So before we get to the canyon in the 1920s, just to give you an example of what Gunnar was doing in Europe before he came to the United States in 1921. During the First World War, he worked primarily around Stockholm and Sweden, and made a couple of trips to northern Sweden and northern Norway. Lofoten is in far northern Norway, and this is a view of a small fishing village called Rena, which is an absolutely wonderful spot. As I mentioned, in 1920, Gunnar moved to America. He arrived here the first week of January 1921 after a week-long steamship journey. And by March 1921, he had made his way up to Yosemite National Park, where he'd wind up spending a couple of years living in the valley, where he would barter paintings with the concessionaire for a place to live and for his meals. This is an example of one of his early paintings of Yosemite, the grand panoramic view from Glacier Point. And here's a photo of Gunnar at work in Yosemite Valley. Notice how small and lightweight his kit is. And if you take a note of his easel, if you look at any other photographs of Gunnar at work, this is the easel that he uses throughout his entire lifetime. So it's kind of like his best buddy there. And you might be able to tell, I'm not sure if you can in the video or not, but he's actually working on a painting of Half Dome in this photograph. So it was in Yosemite Valley that Gunnar met Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, and they had probably heard of each other, through mutual friends over the previous couple of years. But they finally met in March of 1923, and Mather commissioned Gunnar to visit the Southwest, specifically Zion National Park, which has just become a national park the same year as Grand Canyon, 1919. So Gunnar packed up his painting stuff and he headed to Zion and worked there for a few months in the early summer. Here's one painting. And interesting thing about this painting to note is, notice how he really shifted his palette from that painting of Yosemite Valley with its predominantly cool colors, and the beautiful warm colors that he shifted to here in this painting of the Great White Throne. Another thing that Gunnar was very much a master of is, if you notice this beautiful reflected light in this promontory on the right side of the painting over here. So in early July 1923, Gunnar wrote to a friend of his in California that he had been working in Zion for a couple of months and he's ready to take a break, and he was going to go down to the Grand Canyon and do some paintings to take a break from painting at Zion, which kind of always cracks me up. So he drove down to the North Rim initially, and by the way, stayed at the Wiley Way camp there. And if any of you have ever done any kind of research, you'll appreciate this story. This is a photograph from Gunnar's personal scrapbook, which I have had access to. And if you can read his writing at the bottom below the photograph here, you can see that he wrote, "My first picture of Grand Canyon." So for a researcher, that's just about as good as it ever gets. You know, great documentation made by the artist himself in this case. The other remarkable thing about the photograph of this painting, or the painting itself really, is that you recognize it as the great panoramic view from Bright Angel Point on the North Rim. And it always kind of amazes me when I look at this. You know, it ordinarily takes any artist, I would say, at least a few works to become familiar with their subject, and let alone a really complex subject like Grand Canyon. In this painting, Gunnar didn't focus his first attention on, say, Bright Angel Canyon or a small side canyon off the North Rim. He didn't zoom in on, say, one of these temples or both, you know, zoom in on Brahma and Zoroaster or one of the others in the canyon. Instead, he went for the big panoramic view, or I like to say the whole enchilada. And I think that that says an awful lot about his self-confidence. And I think it says an awful lot about his drawing ability as well, that he would, you know, upon his very first visit, sit down and do a painting of this scope. So he returned to Zion later that summer, went back to Yosemite, and the following year returned to both the South and the North Rim, and did this painting from a similar viewpoint, probably from along that trail that goes out to Bright Angel Point. And I don't know, can you see, is this thing blocking the labels up here at the top of the screen?
It's not.
It's not good. Okay, so it's just my screen. So this painting is one of his finest canyon paintings, and it was actually bought by Stephen Mather and given to the King of Sweden as a gift. In late summer 1924, he went up to Yellowstone for his first and only visit. And that winter, Mather had helped arrange for an exhibition of his work at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And here's Gunnar with 6 Grand Canyon paintings. The exhibit included 72 paintings, but here's this is so far the only photograph that I have of that exhibition, which is one of the ironies in this project, because this is, in the National Gallery is associated with the Smithsonian, and very oddly, the Smithsonian has no record of this exhibition. Anyway, at that time, it's interesting to note that William Henry Holmes, one of whose drawings we saw earlier, was the director at the National Gallery. So kind of a nice connection there. So after his exhibition, he went up to New York to try and line up some galleries, and then returned to the canyon. And before we actually head down into the canyon, one more view from the rim. This was painted right at the village bus interchange where you catch the bus out to Hermit Rest at the head of the Bright Angel Trail. Excuse me. And it's worth noting, and maybe the photograph I showed earlier, illustrates this, but Gunnar worked almost entirely outdoors. So everything that we're seeing was painted on location, probably over a period of 10 to 12 days, which is how long it would take him to do a painting like this. So in the spring of 1925, he headed down into the canyon for his first excursion to Phantom Ranch. And he had a commission from the Santa Fe Railroad to do 2 paintings, one of which was of Phantom Ranch, as you can see here, which was just recently completed in its first phase of construction. And if you've been to Phantom Ranch, you'll probably, hopefully, I think, immediately see the historical significance of this photograph because look at how small those cottonwood trees are. Today those cottonwoods tower over the buildings that are probably, I would say, twice the size, at least, that they are in this painting. So an interesting historical document of Phantom Ranch. This painting, a fellow named, what's his first name? I can't think of his first name. William Simpson took over as the head of marketing at the Santa Fe Railroad. And when this painting was sent off to the railroad, Simpson hung this painting in his office. So another painting he did on that trip was a painting of what at that time was called Altar Falls, and today we call it Ribbon Falls. About 5 miles up the North Kaibab Trail from Phantom Ranch. And Gunnar would have walked that 5 miles twice a day to do this painting, again, over a period of maybe 10 or 12 days. So if you ever had a rough commute going to work, and maybe you had a commute as significant as that, but just imagine walking 5 miles one direction on the North Kaibab Trail to get to your work site. So this is another painting that at one time was in the collection of the Santa Fe Railroad. And Gunnar would go on to do a total of 6 paintings for the Santa Fe Railroad. Another painting that he did that spring was this view from Bright Angel Canyon looking back towards, excuse me, the South Rim, maybe a quarter to a half a mile up from the river. And I think one of the notable things about this painting is look at the great texture that he got in the metamorphic rocks there. So by 1928, Gunnar had essentially moved to the South Rim Village. Here are a few historical photos. And the evidence of that is when he would send paintings off to exhibitions, he would give his address as Grand Canyon, Arizona. He found the village, as many of us did, very much to his liking, although he would typically leave during the winter because, ironically, being from Stockholm, he wasn't keen on snow or cold weather. So he would go down to the desert somewhere for a month or 2. The village was, at that time, and really, today still remains, a pretty remote and isolated community. In 1930, the census, for the 1930 census, the population was recorded as being 590. From employees of the Santa Fe Railroad, the Fred Harvey Company, other private concessionaires, and the National Park Service, all were there to support the growing number of visitors. And in the 1920s, visitation to the park was in the 100,000 range, and by 1935, first reached 200,000 visitors, ironically at the height of the Great Depression. Gunnar's Park Service friends included Minor Tillotson, the superintendent at that time, his assistant Mike Harrison, one of Gunnar's closest friends and confidants, Assistant Superintendents George Collins and Pat Petraw, all names that many of you would recognize. Emery Kolb, the photographer who took these photos, was another close friend of Gunnar's. And, again, pretty much like it was when I lived there in the 70s. Social activities were typical of small towns. Service clubs and churches sponsored fundraising activities and social events, various performances and softball games and, that kind of thing. Gunnar was an avid card player. He loved playing bridge and poker, and much of his social time was spent with friends, including Tillotson and both Petras, Pat and Polly, playing cards. And as with his painting, he was a good card player, but also extremely self-critical. Mike Harrison's wife, Elizabeth Hedgeman, wrote a book called Navajo Trading Days, and in it she recorded this little vignette of Widforss. She said, "To us, he was weedy, and his favorite form of relaxation in the evenings was a game of auction bridge with Helen Colton, Mike Harrison, and me. Often we sat at a table in the soda fountain room," meaning the Bright Angel Fountain, which is the first place I worked at the South Rim, "sipping one of Charlie Frazier's chocolate sodas while waiting for an opening bid from Weedy, which not infrequently was Von Klub very weak." He also had a weekly poker game with Les Kennedy, who for a time was the manager at the Altivar, Harry Parker, and Dan McDaig, that meant a lot to the men. So again, a nice little snippet of history here. Harry Parker recalled that if anybody got wiped out of the game, we'd go on playing until he got a good hand. We did this so Weedy wouldn't lose too much. He was always short of cash. We'd set the alarm clock for midnight, and when it went off, we'd finish the hand, then have a snack of Limburger cheese, onions, and rye. Then we'd all go home. One of Gunnar's closest friends at the South Rim was a young woman named Grace Watkins. This is not necessarily Grace Watkins. She ran the Altivar art room for a number of years, and when Widforss first came to the Grand Canyon, it was Grace who told him that he should make his skies larger in his paintings, include more sky. Dan McDaid, who ran the art room after Grace left to take care of her mother when she was elderly, told the Belknaps, who wrote the first book about Gunnar that came out in 1969, that Gunnar was, quote unquote, sweet on Miss Watkins. He took her to the movies frequently. Other friends mentioned that he would spend time each evening talking with her in the art room. And on at least 2 occasions, he sent her boxes of chocolate for Christmas. But as far as we know, there's no evidence yet that their relationship ever went to a more committed level. In addition to concerns about his career and money, maybe the artist's feelings for his mother, who was his closest confidant, were so strong that they impeded his ability to have a fulfilling relationship. By 1934, Watkins, as I mentioned, had returned to upstate New York to care for her mother. Now, this painting, and we will get to the canyon again, he did at least 4 paintings. He did 4 versions of this painting. And if you look at her haircut and you look at her dress, these are absolutely consistent with fashions in the late 20s and early 30s. And unfortunately, there's no photograph of her in Gunnar's scrapbook. So was this done from a photo after Grace had left and, reflected Gunnar's longing for her? Perhaps, I don't know, but I'd like to think that this is Grace. So anyway, back down to the Inner Canyon. In 1929, Gunnar made, as far as I know, his only trip down the Hermit Trail. And this is one of the paintings that he returned with, a small painting of a major promontory called Breezy Point. And if you've hiked down the Hermit Trail, you know Breezy Point, and you remember walking down the cathedral stairs that are in this little corner back here to the left of Breezy Point. I mentioned Carl Oscar Borg earlier. Borg was also from Sweden, although he came to the United States much earlier than Gunnar. He arrived here in 1907. And here's an often reproduced painting that Borg did of Breezy Point when Hermit's Camp was still operating down at the end of the Hermit Trail. operated by the Santa Fe Railroad before Phantom Ranch. And here's a little comparison of the two paintings side by side. So it's worth noting, I mentioned that it would take Gunnar 10 or 12 days to do a painting. And you can see that this is a fairly small painting. I actually can't see the size because of part of the software blocking it on my screen. But as I recall, it's only about 8 by 10 or so. So Gunnar wouldn't have walked down, he wouldn't have, I can't remember how far that is it 8 or 9 miles from the rim down to Hermit Camp? Gunnar wouldn't walk down Hermit Camp and do one little painting like this. So he must have spent several days and probably returned with at least a handful of paintings. Currently, this being the only one that we know from that excursion. The following year, he did this magnificent painting looking up Pipe Creek from near where the Tonto trail crosses the Pipe Creek drainage. And each morning, so he wrote, so let me read this from this excerpt from a letter to his mother first. He said, I painted a picture of Pipe Creek. It took 2 hours to go down, 3 to go up. Good exercise. Left the painting stuff down there wrapped in a waterproof canvas. I've rarely had so much fun to work. I'm seeing new things in the scene and experiencing Grand Canyon more strongly and more seriously. So again, imagine, so if you walk down the Bright Angel Trail and go to Pipe Creek, that's roughly a 7-mile one-way trip. And he was doing that twice a day, so 14 miles round trip. And here's a photo on the right of Gunnar with the painting standing out on the rim there somewhere. And notice his cool little Fred Harvey Thunderbird key fob there. Very common product in the Fred Harvey curio shops at that time. So then back right around the corner from Pipe Creek at the end of Plateau Point, Gunnar did, arguably one of his very finest paintings of the canyon, this view from Plateau Point looking north towards Brahma and Zoroaster. And you can see the Colorado River down here. So it seems likely. Now, Gunnar was a very verbose letter writer. And pretty much everything I know about him comes from letters written either to his mother. He wrote more than 350 letters to his mother as an adult over his lifetime. But also letters to Mike Harrison and Mike Collins and other close friends. So the only actual evidence we have of him working on this is an anecdote from Emery Cole that I'll get to in a minute. But now if you think about it, so I imagine that many of you have hiked to Plateau Point, and many of you have probably done that day hike down Kaibab Trail over the Tonto through Pipe Creek and then back up Bright Angel Trail, or vice versa, which is about a 14-mile round hike. But anyway, so if I was doing this and knowing Gunnar, again, he wouldn't go and just work on this and then hike back out. So he probably was at least working on another painting from Plateau Point, or more likely, I imagine that he would work here in the morning. This is painted in mid-morning light. I imagine he worked on this for a couple of hours and then walked over to Pipe Creek, which is about 4-ish miles, as I recall. Worked on the Pipe Creek painting in the afternoon. It's painted in early afternoon light, and then hiked back out. Because he wouldn't, he was a workaholic. So he wasn't going to just go down there and do one thing. He would maximize his time. So again, there's no evidence of that, but I think that's extremely likely. Anyway, if he did that, his daily commute would be 17 miles. So consider that. So despite his love of cigarettes and whiskey, he was obviously a vigorous hiker. And as I already mentioned, he well, in at least one letter to his mother, he said that he could hike from Phantom Ranch to the rim in 3.5 hours, and that's basically what Phantom Ranchers would do it in. And I've done it that quickly, and that's not running, but it's walking really fast. So Emery Kolb, so a couple of anecdotes from Kolb. Kolb said that on multiple occasions, he saw Gunnar go down the Kaibab Trail, across the Tonto, and up the Bright Angel Trail for a lunch break. Which is a heck of a lunch break in my mind. And in fact, Kolb hiked down to Plateau Point on multiple occasions during the 10 days or so that Gunnar was working on this painting. And in one of the very funniest stories in either Gunnar's life or Kolb's life, and this story comes from Emery Kolb's grandson, Smokey, who I know some of you have met. So Kolb was with Gunnar when he completed this painting. And you may know that Emery Kolb was an amateur painter, and one of the things he really liked doing was hand coloring his photographs. And so when Gunnar finished this painting, again, arguably one of the finest paintings ever made at the canyon, Kolb, who had some attitude, said, in paraphrasing, "Well, Gunnar, that's a fine painting, but let's do this." So Kolb went over and found a dead agave and stuck it into the rocks here and took a photograph. So he thought that adding the agave improved the composition. And in fact, it's kind of a trite compositional device. Gunnar's composition was perfectly dandy as it was. But anyway, so Kolb took this photograph and hand colored it, as you can see. And periodically, this is exhibited in the gallery at Kolb's studio. I don't know if it's there right now or not. But then there he is so then he later did an oil painting from his photograph. And here's his oil painting from that photograph. So, cocky little fellow. And just for comparison, now the cool thing about this is if you look at Gunnar's painting, you can see that it's spot on, with one exception. Notice how he shrank the space between, I think that's Wotan's Throne all the way over on the right. Notice how he shrank the space between Wotan's Throne and Zoroaster just a little bit to create a tighter composition. Well, okay, so here's a map, and I thought about highlighting this a little bit better, but here's a map of the main corridor. And what I did was I identified the locations that Gunnar worked, in a large cluster down around Phantom Ranch, which we're going to see a few more of, and then the Plateau Point painting, the Pipe Creek painting, and then over here, the Breezy Point painting. So another of his very finest paintings of the canyon made from the Clear Creek Trail is this painting looking downstream at the Colorado River, and then Bright Angel Canyon goes up to the right there. And this painting is in the collection of the Grand Canyon National Park Museum. And you can see, it's just a tour de force in all respects in terms of the color, the texture, an incredibly complicated piece of geography that, really, Gunnar could draw like nobody else. And that's why he was able to address a complex scene like this. Eddie McKee, who we also knew at the South Rim, a naturalist at the South Rim at that time, Eddie McKee complimented Gunnar on his ability to capture complex geology like this. And Gunnar said, "I know nothing about geology," which was probably true, except that he had very finely tuned eyes. View of the Colorado River from where the Black Bridge is today. This painting used to belong to Phantom Ranch manager Tom Moore, who was another friend of Gunnar's, and then one more view from the same location, just to show slightly different palette and treatment. And then another view from, like right beside Bright Angel Creek, looking back up towards Plateau Point, in fact. So in the winter of 1930, it was a very cold winter, and Gunnar spent actually several months down at Phantom Ranch that winter. And did I mention that ranch manager Ron Moore made moonshine earlier? I can't remember. Yeah, so Moore was a moonshiner, which is probably another reason Gunnar enjoyed spending time at Phantom Ranch. And in that winter, Gunnar and Moore assisted in a rescue of a ranger. I don't know his first name, but in the record, he was Ranger Satterwhite, who had left Phantom and was on his way to the North Rim. And he became stranded in the box in that section of the inner gorge where Bright Angel Creek flows. And Carl Leonard, the son-in-law of Emery Cole, called from Roaring Springs to Phantom Ranch and said that Satterwhite was overdue. So Tom Moore and Gunnar grabbed some rope and some tackle and hardware, such as it would have been at that time, and they struck off up Bright Angel Creek, where they found Satterwhite stranded in the middle of the stream and a raging torrent. And they strung a rope across the creek and kind of set up a Tyrolean traverse kind of situation. And despite his reservations, Gunnar agreed to go over and help Satterwhite. And when he was halfway across the stream, the rangers kind of left him dangling there for a few minutes and said, so long, see you later, Gunnar. And he got all flustered and ticked off at them, but they pulled him back to shore, and all was forgiven. So on his return, here's another view from partway down Bright Angel Creek to the Colorado River. Interesting note about this painting: it was originally purchased by Mary Jane Coulter, and she gave it as a gift to Max Trissler, who was married to one of the Verkamp girls, as thanks for his work for her. And when I first saw this painting, and maybe you think the same thing, I thought, wow, this is really unusual. These are very somber colors relative to Gunnar's usual palette, and it always makes me so not to cast any unnecessary meaning, but it always makes me think of the Wizard of Oz, and the Wicked Witch's Castle. Anyway, so after the rescue and a few more weeks spent at Phantom Ranch, Gunnar returned to the South Rim, and he wrote to his friend Mike Harrison, who had left the canyon at that point, was working in New Mexico. He wrote, "I got 5 pictures from 7 weeks down at Phantom. Believe they are not so bad. If they really are of selling value is hard to tell. Season is awfully poor this year. 15 to 30 people a day arrive on the train." So again, this is in the early days of the Depression. And, like all artists during the 1930s, Gunnar's business took a pretty hard hit. And he said, well, it ought to get better one of these days, or it'll just be too bad. One final painting, and I'm wrapping up with this one because it's really unusual. Dennis, if you're still here after our little incident, Dennis Foster helped me identify the location for this painting, and as soon as he said it, I went, oh, of course. So this is from the trail from Bright Angel Creek walking down towards where the Silver Bridge is today. And in fact, I think that if we were standing at this location, you'd see the Silver Bridge off to the left where it crosses the Colorado River. But I mentioned this as an unusual painting because as far as, and maybe this is one that he was actually referring to, because it's of really limited commercial value. And he would have known that. So this is really something that he, probably did more for his own interest, because it doesn't feature the river, and it doesn't feature any, of the notable promontories or, intercanyon buttes or temples. As far as canyon subjects go, it's really anonymous. But it came up for auction in California a few years, and I was really excited to see it exactly for those reasons. Because it just, it's kind of a generic view right along the river. So between 1925 and 1932, Gunnar Widforss spent at least 130 days working in the Inner Canyon. And currently, I only know of 14 paintings that he did. But based on my knowledge of his work habits and his production schedule, he probably did over that time, if he was true to form, he probably did between 40 and 60 paintings that have yet to come back to light. Where they are, I have no idea, but I look forward to seeing them surface, hopefully, and catalog those, add those to the catalog raisonné. The canyon, actually, let me go to the work that he did in the Inner Canyon is, without question, among his finest. The paintings feature really clear, brilliant color, really great descriptions of very complex landscape space, and like the Plateau Point painting and some of the others I showed you, really dynamic compositions. Without the addition of compositional gizmos like Emery's agave. So without the romantic hyperbole that just characterizes so many paintings of the canyon and the West in general, Gunnar approached his subject with passion and intelligence and objectivity, and he established really an artistic bar and a body of work, a legacy that continues to inspire and serve as a form of mentorship for artists today. So if you have questions, I would be delighted to answer any questions you might have about Gunnar or his time at the South Rim or the Inner Canyon.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was great to see all of those paintings. And if any of you that are still here would like to ask Alan questions, this is a good time to it. We also have a few comments and questions in the chat box, but let me just open it up to everybody first. If anybody has any questions or comments to Alan, and you'll have to unmute yourself to do that.
Hi, Alan.
Go ahead.
This is Terry Cleland. I'm on the East Coast right now, but was recently in Arizona. But anyhow, how did he pass away? He was only 55 years old.
Well, he smoked like a chimney. When he was in his early 20s working in France, he wrote to his mother, "Have cut down on cigarettes from 30 or 40 a day to 10 or 20.
Which makes his hiking even more impressive.
Yeah. So when he was talking about hiking from Phantom to the Rim in 3.5 hours, that was with minimal cigarette breaks. He developed angina, and I think he had heart problems most of his life, actually, because even as a young man, he complained of stomach problems that I think today would be recognized as indicative of heart issues. So he he was actually driving from the El Tovar down to the Bright Angel, and he had a heart attack moments after he started driving down there, and he died pretty much instantly.
Thanks.
Terry Cleland was also asking, how much did the painting that came up for auction sell for, the one that was needed to be identified by you and Dennis Foster?
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. Not a well, because of its subject matter, probably not a lot. I'm guessing $6,000 or $7,000. Whereas, if the Plateau Point painting were to come up for auction, that would go for probably, I mean, it's hard, it's hard to say, but between 50 and 100,000.
Wow. Well, that kind of plays into a question from Kim Christensen. Just want to mentioning what a fine and informative presentation. What would one of his paintings sell for today? And you've given us an indication between 50,000 and 100,000.
Yeah, and that would be for, so again, like artists everywhere during, the 2008 recession, everybody's market prices dropped pretty precipitously. And so, like most other artists, Gunnar's market value is slowly rebuilding from that. And if a major Grand Canyon painting like this came up, it would go for, between 50 and 100,000. A painting that he did on Catalina Island right before he went to Yosemite in 1921 recently sold for 90,000.
Richard Aceves is asking, did Gunnar use gouache?
He did on occasion, but not regularly. And the only time he used it, well, as an exception, I've seen examples where he would use it for white in waterfalls, but he didn't always do that.
Can you just explain what gouache is to those that don't?
Gouache is opaque watercolor. You say it like gouache, say it like GWAS.
Okay.
So he primarily worked in transparent watercolor, but gouache is a more coarsely ground paint. Pigment's more coarsely ground, and so it's opaque. But a quick aside, it's notable that in 1926, he did two very large paintings, roughly 30 by 40 inches, done entirely with gouache, one of Half Dome and one of Mount Rainier. But those were big exceptions to his usual method.
Peter Corbett is asking, it looks like these paintings show greener landscapes in many of them, and perhaps he was painting in the springtime or after the rainy season. Do you see it that way, or is it maybe a function of just looking at these on a computer?
These colors are fairly accurate. If you think about the early painting of Phantom Ranch and like Altar Falls, Ribbon Falls, those were done in the spring. The Plateau Point painting, I think, was done in the fall. I can say that in person, the Plateau Point painting isn't quite this brilliant. So that is to some degree an artifact of my computer, yes.
Okay, and Ann Webster is asking, how did the Depression affect his livelihood overall?
I kind of skipped over that because I didn't want to take too long. I got yanked off the stage at the History Symposium. I didn't want to get yanked off the stage tonight. So once the Depression hit, like artists everywhere, Gunnar's prices, he was forced to lower his prices. So for example, a painting like the Plateau Point painting we see here, which actually he gave to Emery Kolb. So this is in the Kolb family collection. But if he was selling this, say in 1928, he would have charged around $500 for it. And in today's dollars, that's roughly equivalent to $5,000. So by 1932, 33, 34, he would have reduced the price for something like this to $250 or $300. And he was selling far fewer of them. His friends at the Canyon, who kind of looked out for his business interests. So Gunnar was really good at making money, but he wasn't that great at managing it. He had a great business plan. You can see in the photograph on the right, which was taken at Yavapai Point. He worked where people saw them. He was present. Hundreds of tourists would have walked by him in a day. And he had his work in the El Tovar Hotel. He had his work in the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite. But once the Depression hit, his friends at the Canyon said, Gunnar, this is an awesome painting, Plateau Point say, but why don't you do some smaller, simpler ones? And he actually did. There are examples, and if you go into the catalog Raisonné, you can see them, where he did smaller paintings and with far less detail than, say, in this Plateau Point painting. And in a letter to Mike Harrison, he said, I hate doing these and I'm not going to do any more. They also encouraged him to do oil paintings. And it was in the late 20s, early 30s where he did a small number of oil paintings, but he also didn't like oil paint. And I think that's because he was very mobile. And, doing oil paintings and transporting a wet oil painting is much more involved than transporting watercolors.
Constance is asking if you know how much time he spent at the North Rim.
Yes. And so I mentioned his work habits and the fact that it would take him 10 or 12 paintings, 10 or 12 days to do a painting. When I first started working on this project in about 2012, right off the bat, people were asking me how long it took him to do a painting and how many paintings did I think he did in his lifetime. So I made a spreadsheet because based on his letters, I know when he was traveling and when he wasn't traveling. So I got a very accurate timeline for his life. And so I made a spreadsheet and I can block out the periods when he wasn't traveling and I could calculate how many paintings he would have done in that period when he was settled somewhere. Once he began spending time at the Grand Canyon, he would spend at least a month and sometimes more on the North Rim each year, particularly in the late summer and fall, because he loved painting aspen trees. And I don't have any examples of those here, but again, if you go to the catalog, you can see them. And again, in another letter to Mike Harrison, he said, have been here now, the North Rim, for a couple of weeks, and I have a couple of paintings in the shop. We'll see how they do, meaning regular, views of the canyon from the rim, which would have been his bread and butter at that time. And now engaged in painting aspen trees, which I find far more fascinating, quote unquote. So his favorite subject from the time he was young until he died, his favorite subject was always trees. And, if you look at his paintings of aspen trees, they're some of his most amazing paintings. And I'm a patient person, but he had some patience like I can't even imagine.
Well,
So
we'll just do two more here. There's also a question: which museum or gallery has the best collection of his work?
Museum of Northern Arizona.
Okay.
Gunnar began his relationship with the museum probably shortly after it opened in 1928. He exhibited, Mary Russell Farrell Colton, one of the founders and the first art curator, hosted an annual exhibition called the Arizona Artists and Craftsmen Exhibition at the museum in the summer that they did for 7, 8, 9, 10 years in the late 20s, early 30s. And we actually have a painting in our collection. We have 23 paintings in our collection now. And one of those paintings, a painting of the San Francisco Peaks, has a tag on the back of it that was for one of those summer exhibitions that was filled out by Mary Russell Farrell Colton. So we have the largest collection, and after M&A, the Oakland Museum in California has a couple of paintings. The Phoenix Museum has 3 or 4. But then the next largest collections really are distributed among members of his family in Sweden.
Okay, and Robin is asking, this is a good one to finish with. Can you tell us about your book publishing plans?
Oh, yes. Happily, audience. Yeah, I've been in conversation with the publisher at Fresco Books in New Mexico, who you may know have done a number of really beautiful books by other Western artists. So I'm very excited to be talking with them, and I fully expect to go through with that, and probably, I mean, it's we've only had one conversation, so it's too early to say much. But I would hope that maybe by the end of next year, the book will be available. And I'd like to. My vision is a beautifully illustrated book. It's not, as you can imagine, it's going to be beautifully illustrated. And the cool thing about Gunnar is the more I learn, the more interesting his life becomes. He was a classic bohemian, and he lived life to the fullest. And people loved him. His friends at the South Rim Village, it's safe to say they adored him. He was a beloved member of that little community. And I feel so fortunate to be able to tell his story.
Well, he only lived 55 years, but they were 55 full years, and he spent a lot of it at the Grand Canyon. And how good is that? So thank you so much, Alan. And just to let everybody know, of course, we will be editing out the little interruption we had when this is posted online. And we so appreciate everybody attending tonight. And thank you, Alan, for that wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Alan.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.